In life, we are often comfortable with the familiar, but comfort is not the measure of destiny. Many great men and women failed, not because they lacked talent, but because they refused to transition when God spoke. When God told Abraham to leave his homeland, it was a moment of divine exit, a call not just to leave a place, but to step into purpose. When Israel was commanded to leave Egypt, it was not just a physical departure, but a spiritual shift from slavery to nationhood. God's timing is perfect, and when He says it's time to go, there is a reason. The purpose of exiting is not about abandonment. It is about alignment. God never calls us out of something without preparing a place for us to go. Joseph had to exit the prison before he could enter the palace. The disciples had to leave their nets before they could become world changers. Every divine exit is connected to a greater entrance. Sometimes God removes us from jobs, relationships, or environments not because they are bad, but because they are not aligned with where He is taking us. The danger of resistance. There is danger in ignoring God's call to exit. Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt because she looked back when God said to move forward. Saul lost his kingdom because he refused to obey God's instructions. The longer we delay, the more we risk losing the next season of blessing. Fear, doubt, and attachment to the past can become our greatest enemies. But faith is required to walk into the unknown with confidence. When God calls for an exit, it means He has already prepared provision for the next season. Just as a bird does not worry about where the next branch will be, we must trust that God has already positioned the right opportunities, relationships, and resources in our next destination. Walking in obedience to divine timing ensures that we are always in the center of God's will. Timing is one of the most critical aspects of life. Everything in creation operates on a schedule, whether it is the rising and setting of the sun, the changing of the seasons, or the cycle of life itself. Just as nature follows a divine pattern, so does our personal journey. The challenge many people face is not recognizing the appointed time for a transition. When God declares that it is time to exit, He is not speaking randomly. He is revealing that a shift has been scheduled in His divine calendar. Those who can perceive this shift and move accordingly experience growth, while those who resist it often find themselves stuck in a season that has already expired. Divine timing is not based on human calculations or emotions. It is not about whether we feel ready or whether circumstances seem favorable. When God called Noah to build the ark, there was no sign of rain. When He told Abraham to leave his homeland, there was no visible evidence of a better place. And when Jesus told Peter to step out of the boat, there was no guarantee that he would walk on water. These moments were not dictated by logic or comfort, but by divine instruction. Similarly, when God says it's time to exit, He is not waiting for everything to make sense to us. He expects us to trust His wisdom over our understanding. One of the greatest challenges with divine timing is that it often disrupts our plans. Many people build their lives around routines, ambitions, and expectations that seem secure. However, God operates outside of human schedules. What we think is the perfect time to stay may actually be the appointed time to leave. This is why discernment is essential. If we are not sensitive to the voice of God, we may miss the window of transition and delay the next stage of our destiny. The Israelites, for example, were given a set time to leave Egypt. Had they hesitated, they would have remained in slavery longer than necessary. Likewise, when God calls us to move, hesitation can result in unnecessary hardship and missed opportunities. Another key aspect of divine timing is preparation. God does not move randomly. He orchestrates exits to prepare us for entrances. Before Elijah was taken up to heaven, Elisha had to recognize the moment of transition and position himself for the double portion. Before David became king, he had to exit the fields as a shepherd and step into the palace as a warrior. Before Paul became the great apostle, he had to leave behind his old identity as Saul, the persecutor. Every divine calling is preceded by a divine departure. This is why we must be willing to leave certain places, relationships, and mindsets when God says, time. Many people struggle with divine timing because they confuse delay with waiting. Waiting is an act of faith, trusting God's plan while remaining in position. Delay, on the other hand, is the result of ignoring divine instruction. The difference between the two is obedience. When God told the children of Israel to enter the promised land, their fear caused them to delay. As a result, an 11-day journey turned into a 40-year wilderness experience. Delayed obedience is still disobedience, and it can cost us valuable time. Recognizing divine timing also requires spiritual sensitivity. God's voice is often not loud or dramatic. It comes as a gentle prompting, a deep conviction, or a door that suddenly closes. Many times we ignore these signs because they are inconvenient. We pray for direction, but when God answers, we resist. We ask for new opportunities, but when God says, let go of the old, we hesitate. This is why many people remain in unfruitful situations longer than they should. They are holding on to something that God has already declared finished. The key to unlocking the next season is surrender. When we trust that God's timing is perfect, we can move without fear, knowing that He has already prepared the next step. One of the greatest biblical examples of recognizing divine timing is Jesus Himself. Throughout His ministry, He frequently spoke about the appointed time. He knew when to begin, when to retreat, when to advance, and when to exit. Even in His final moments, He declared, "It is finished," signaling that His earthly mission had reached its appointed end. He did not stay beyond His assignment. He moved in perfect alignment with divine timing. This is the lesson for all of us. When God says it is time to exit, it means the mission in that place is complete. Staying beyond that moment only leads to stagnation. In our personal lives, divine timing applies to every area, our careers, relationships, ministry, and even our personal growth. There are moments when God says it's time to move on, not because the situation is bad, but because He has something greater ahead. The challenge is to trust that His exits are always connected to a higher purpose. The moment we embrace this truth, we begin to walk in divine acceleration, stepping into the fullness of what God has prepared for us. Exits are not just about leaving, they are about aligning with something greater, Every movement in life has a purpose, and when God calls for an exit, it is never to abandon or punish, it is to advance. Too often, people perceive exits as losses rather than transitions. They fear stepping away from a job, a relationship, a position, or even a mindset because they assume that what they are leaving behind is all there is. However, God never calls someone to exit without having already prepared the next stage of their journey. His exits are always connected to His divine plan for our lives. Throughout history, exits have been a key part of God's strategy for elevation. Abraham had to exit his homeland before he could become the father of nations. Moses had to exit Pharaoh's palace before he could deliver Israel. Ruth had to exit Moab before she could walk into her destiny with Boaz. Even Jesus had to exit his heavenly throne, come to earth, and then exit the earth again to complete his mission. Every time God called someone to exit, it was not to leave them empty, it was to position them for purpose. When God says it's time to exit, it means that staying any longer would limit growth, hinder progress, or prevent the fulfillment of His will. One of the greatest struggles people face when it comes to exits is the attachment to the familiar. Human nature is drawn to comfort, predictability, and stability. When God instructed Lot and his family to leave Sodom, the command was clear: do not look back. Yet, Lot's wife turned around, longing for what was behind, and as a result, she turned into a pillar of salt. This is a powerful lesson. When God calls for an exit, looking back can cause stagnation or destruction. Many people miss their next level because they are too busy holding on to the past. They remain in places where God's presence has already departed, trying to revive what He has already declared finished. Exits also serve the purpose of protection. Sometimes God calls us to leave a situation not because it is bad at the moment, but because He sees what is coming. Noah and his family had to enter the ark before the flood came. Joseph and Mary had to flee to Egypt with baby Jesus before Herod's decree to kill all male infants. The Israelites had to exit Egypt before Pharaoh had another opportunity to tighten his grip. God always moves ahead of danger, but it requires faith to exit when everything seems fine. Many people resist exits because they cannot see the danger ahead, but God, in His infinite wisdom, orchestrates exits to shield His people from unseen harm. Another purpose of exits is transformation. Leaving one place is often necessary to become who we are meant to be. David was anointed king while still a shepherd, but he had to exit the fields and step into the battlefield before he could enter the palace. His calling required him to transition through different stages, each demanding obedience to divine timing. Likewise, Paul had to exit his former identity as Saul, the persecutor, before he could walk in his destiny as an apostle. When God calls for an exit, it is because what we are leaving behind can no longer sustain the person we are becoming. Our next level requires a new environment, new challenges, and new experiences to refine us. Exits are also about obedience. Many times, God will instruct us to leave something behind, even when we do not fully understand why. When Jesus called His disciples, He simply said, "Follow me," and they immediately left their boats, their businesses, and their old way of life. They did not ask for a detailed plan, nor did they hesitate. Their exit from their past allowed them to step into one of the greatest callings in history. Had they delayed or refused, they would have missed the opportunity to be used by God. The same principle applies today. Delayed obedience can cost us divine opportunities. A critical aspect of divine exits is that they often come with resistance. Pharaoh did not want to let the Israelites go. Some people will not want to release you from relationships. Some workplaces will try to hold you back, and some mindsets will resist change. But when God says it's time, no human opposition can stop His plan. The only thing that can delay the process is personal fear and unwillingness to obey. People must understand that every divine exit is also a divine entrance. We are not just leaving something behind, we are stepping into something greater. Exits are a sign of progress. Growth requires movement, and movement requires change. God will never ask us to leave something without preparing something better ahead. The key is to trust that His exits are always purposeful, always timely, and always leading to something far greater than we could ever imagine. The challenge is whether we will recognize the moment and move in faith, or resist and remain in a place that no longer serves our destiny. One of the greatest struggles in human nature is the battle between resistance and obedience. When God calls for an exit, He is not making a suggestion, He is giving an instruction that is designed for our good. Yet, many people resist His leading either out of fear, attachment, or a lack of trust. Resistance to divine instruction often leads to unnecessary struggles, delays, and hardships. On the other hand, obedience to God's voice always results in growth, provision, and alignment with His purpose. The question is not whether God is calling people to exit certain places, relationships, or seasons. It is whether they are willing to obey or whether they will resist until circumstances force them to move. Resistance is often rooted in fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of losing security, and fear of stepping into unfamiliar territory can all prevent a person from obeying God's direction. When the Israelites were led out of Egypt, they had seen the mighty hand of God perform miracles on their behalf. Yet, as soon as they encountered difficulty in the wilderness, their first reaction was to resist. They cried out, longing to return to Egypt, the very place of their bondage. This is the reality of many people. God calls them out of something, but because the next stage requires faith, they desire to go back to what is familiar, even if it is limiting them. The Israelites' resistance delayed their entry into the promised land by 40 years, proving that when God says it is time to exit, resisting His will only prolongs the process. Another major cause of resistance is attachment. People often become emotionally tied to places, people, or positions that were only meant to be temporary. When God instructed Abraham to leave his homeland, it was a call to separate from everything familiar so that he could receive something greater. But had Abraham resisted and stayed in his comfort zone, he would have never become the father of many nations. Many people miss their next season because they are unwilling to let go of what God is telling them to leave behind. The challenge of obedience is trusting that God's plan is better than our attachment. Holding on to what God has already called us to leave can cause stagnation and, in some cases, destruction. Resistance can also come from a lack of understanding. Some people struggle with obedience because they do not see the full picture. They want all the details before they move, but faith does not work that way. When God called Peter to step out of the boat and walk on water, Peter did not receive an explanation. He received a command, "Come." As long as Peter obeyed, he walked on water, but the moment he allowed doubt to creep in, he began to sink. This is what happens when people hesitate to obey God's instruction to exit. The more time spent analyzing and questioning, the more room there is for doubt, and doubt leads to inaction. God's instructions do not always come with full explanations, but they do come with the assurance that His way is perfect. Delayed obedience is still disobedience. Many people tell themselves that they will obey God when the time is right, but what they fail to realize is that the right time is when God speaks. Saul, the first king of Israel, is a perfect example of this. When God commanded him to destroy the Amalekites completely, he obeyed, partially keeping what he thought was good rather than fully following God's instruction. As a result, he lost his kingdom. Many people experience unnecessary losses because they only obey when it is convenient for them. Partial obedience is still disobedience, and it can cost a person their destiny. In contrast, obedience to God's instruction to exit always leads to blessing and divine alignment. When Jesus called his disciples, they immediately left everything to follow him. They did not ask for a plan or a guarantee of success. They obeyed in faith. As a result, they stepped into a life that transformed history. True obedience does not require knowing every detail. It only requires trust in the one who is giving the instruction. God does not ask people to exit something without already preparing something greater ahead. The difficulty is that the transition often requires moving before the next stage is revealed. This is where faith comes in. God's call to exit is often a test of obedience. Those who resist often find themselves struggling longer than necessary, while those who obey experience acceleration. Jonah is a clear example of this principle. When God told him to go to Nineveh, he resisted and ran in the opposite direction. His resistance led him into the belly of a great fish, a place of hardship and isolation. Only when he repented and obeyed did he see God's purpose fulfilled. This story reveals a powerful truth. Resistance leads to unnecessary struggles, but obedience leads to divine fulfillment. Resistance and obedience are choices. Every person reaches a point where they must decide whether to move with God or remain where they are. Those who resist risk delaying or even forfeiting what God has prepared for them. Those who obey may not always have immediate clarity, but they will always have divine provision. God never calls someone to exit without already having a destination in mind. The key to walking in purpose is to trust His timing, obey His voice, and move when He says, "It's time to exit." Letting go is one of the most difficult yet rewarding principles of life. It is human nature to hold on to people, places, positions, and even past experiences because they provide a sense of security and familiarity. However, when God declares that it is time to exit, He is not calling for loss but for gain. The challenge is that gain often requires release. Those who learn to let go when God instructs them will always find themselves stepping into greater blessings, while those who resist often experience unnecessary struggles. The blessing is never in staying where God has moved on from. It is in embracing what He has prepared ahead. One of the reasons letting go is so difficult is because it requires trust. When God asks someone to leave something behind, it is often without showing them the full picture of what is next. This was the case with Abraham when he was instructed to leave his homeland. He was given a promise, but no specific details, only a call to obey. Had Abraham refused to let go of his past, he would have missed out on becoming the father of many nations. This is a powerful lesson. Whenever God asks for something to be released, it is because He has something far greater in store. The problem is that many people are so focused on what they are losing that they fail to see what they are about to gain. Letting go also requires a shift in mindset. Many people associate exits with failure, believing that if they leave a job, a relationship, or a position, they have somehow lost. However, exits are not about failure. They are about alignment. When a season has ended, staying too long can lead to stagnation. The children of Israel were given a promised land, but they had to leave Egypt first. Had they refused to let go of their past, they would have remained in bondage. Many people today remain in mental, emotional, and spiritual bondage simply because they refuse to release what God has already declared finished. The key to receiving new blessings is to let go of expired seasons. Letting go is also about making room for the new. Imagine trying to pour fresh water into a cup that is already full. No matter how pure the new water is, it cannot fill a vessel that is already occupied. The same principle applies to life. God cannot pour new blessings into a heart, mind, or life that is still clinging to the old. This is why Jesus taught that new wine must be placed in new wineskins. Old mindsets, old habits, and old attachments cannot contain the new things that God wants to do. In order to receive, there must first be a release. Many times, the blessing in letting go is not immediately visible. When Ruth left Moab, she had no idea that she was walking into divine favor. All she knew was that she was following Naomi into an unknown future. But because she was willing to let go of her past, she stepped into a lineage that would lead to King David and ultimately to Jesus Christ. This shows that obedience in letting go has generational impact. The decisions made today to exit an expired place or season will not only affect an individual, but also those connected to them. Some people remain in situations that no longer serve their purpose simply because they fear the unknown. But what if the unknown holds more blessing than anything they have ever experienced? Letting go is also about surrendering control. People often resist exiting because they want to control the outcome. They want to know exactly where they are going, what will happen next, and how things will work out. But faith does not operate that way. Faith requires trusting that even though the next step is unclear, God is already there. When Peter, James, and John left their fishing nets to follow Jesus, they had no roadmap for what was ahead. All they had was a command to follow. Their willingness to release their old lives made way for them to become part of the greatest movement in history. Had they held on to their nets, they would have remained ordinary fishermen instead of world-changing disciples. The truth is, not everything or everyone is meant to go with us into the next season. There are some relationships, habits, and even opportunities that were only meant for a specific time. When their purpose is complete, holding on to them can become a hindrance rather than a blessing. This is why pruning